Now that we've heard from the leaders of two cities, it's time to hear from two research and advocacy experts who can further shed light on where our housing needs are the greatest and how they can be met in a sustainable manner. Colleen Fisher is the executive director of the Council for Affordable and Rural Housing. This is a nonprofit that's been advocating for rural housing initiatives for the last 35 years. And Sarah Rosen Wartell is the president of the Urban Institute. I love the Urban Institute, a research and policy organization devoted to strengthening communities. You know, I should say to Colleen, I also love the Council for Affordable and Rural Housing, but I've known Sarah for a long time. And Sarah, you're the data lady. I mean, Urban Institute is all data, no politics. When you look at this question that we're talking about today of trying to kind of deal with communities as they are, not necessarily as we'd like to dream them up to be, what does the data say?
Well, first, thanks, Steve, for always love someone who's going to say good things about the Urban Institute, so thank you, and great to be here. Sadly, the challenges that we faced as a country on affordable housing supply and affordability for families were severe before this crisis, and they were severe in many places around the country. We tend to think about affordable housing as a problem in our big cities, particularly the very high-cost cities. But in fact, what we know is that affordability issues are severe in rural communities and in suburban communities. You saw two mayors from very different kinds of places. Mesa's a mid-sized city, a satellite to a big city. Miami is a huge area that is a high-cost city. But if you look at a rural community, you have the same issues of housing supply and of families that are spending far too much of their income. And all of that was true before COVID. And with the impact on so many families, first the COVID payments and then the expanded UI helped many, not all. We still saw a really dramatic increase in the rate of both for people not paying on their mortgages and people not paying their rent, but not as great as one would expect. But when these eviction moratoria stop and when the unemployment insurance, if we don't have a deal to provide that support and provide additional support for housing, we are looking at, in rural, suburban, and urban communities, a wave of potential housing loss that could be as deep as we saw during the Great Recession, and its consequences could be lasting for both health and our ability to recover from this economic crisis.
That's very sobering. Colleen, let me turn this to you and ask, you know, we often talk about policy topics, and we do address rural-urban divides, you know, difference in broadband, difference, you know, a lot of areas, infrastructure. What does the scene look like when it comes to housing challenges in the rural area that you've been addressing for so many years?
Well, with the rural housing, one of the things that happens is that when people think initially about housing, they think of the programs that are administered by HUD. And the financing, the core financing for rural comes out of the United States Department of Agriculture within the rural development segment within the USDA. So, you know, one of the problems is that when you start talking about, for instance, rental assistance for the residents, rural residents typically can't take advantage of the Section 8 program. There's a whole separate program that is there for the rural residents. And just like HUD, and the USDA obviously has a lot of programs that are funded under the Ag Department and the Ag appropriations. And so the rural development is constantly, you know, fighting for money from even within their own agency. And so that's one of the things that when we go into a conversation on Capitol Hill and we talk to folks, we have to make sure that we have to say, okay, don't forget, it's two separate agencies, two different programs. They don't mesh necessarily all the time. And what you give to one doesn't necessarily go to the other.
Well, do you think that needs to be changed? I mean, I'm not joking. When I do read Urban Institute reports, I pay attention to them. I try to be semi-literate in the topics that I discuss. But honestly, I didn't know what you just shared about the Department of Agriculture and these rural community grants being there. Does that need, I mean, again, this is an opportunity to talk about reshaping things. Should that line be reshaped in some way so that those monies come under another set of authorities? Or do we just simply need to do better marketing on where they are?
That has been a subject of discussion throughout the years with a variety of different people. My feeling is that there just needs to be a better marketing of the programs, that there needs to be more, because when you talk about housing in rural communities, it is housing that is for people who live in rural areas of the country. And the way the agencies are structured and the way the agency is structured within itself is that, for instance, when there is what's going on down in Louisiana with any hurricanes and whatever, the one criticism that you don't have when you have an emergency like a hurricane or floods or whatever it might be is that USDA is right on the ground. They've got servicing centers all across the country. And, they're able to probably get to folks. And it usually happens then in some areas, it's a rural community that is probably more impacted. And so, I think maybe if you talk about maybe more cooperation amongst the agencies, a deregulation type of thing, I think that is important.
Sarah, did you want to jump in on that?
I'm not going to weigh in on agency. We can spend a lot of time rearranging the boxes, but I do want to talk about the bigger question, which is our understanding of affordable housing needs. I think there are two key things that we tend not to think about, and we're here at around a Republican convention, and yet there is a lot that lots of different parts of our country, red, purple, and blue, have in common on this. The first is housing is not just kind of an outcome you pay more or less for rent. It is what provides stability for people so that they have agency, the ability to make choices, to be able to pursue work, the ability, especially if you're in a job loss, to provide support for your family. And that is true for Americans in rural communities. That's true for Americans in suburban and urban areas. The second thing is the degree to which housing is a core part of our economy. I mean, Colleen's members are businesses. Many of them are not large businesses. We tend to think about people owing rent to some big corporate entity, but 88% of American renters pay their rent to a relative for rent in a housing unit that is relatively small. It could be a single family rental, it could be 2 to 4, the different flats, or it could be a property that has 12 to 20 units in it. And when tenants can't pay their rent, the businesses in those communities can't pay their taxes. And we heard from our two mayors about the huge hit to revenue for so many state and local governments. This is really a problem of housing affordability, and the housing crisis we're facing is really a problem that all of our communities share.
Sarah, I really appreciate you talking about the synergies of these issues and how, when you're not paying one place, it's going to hit the other. And, we also have this, I don't know, this ledge that we're facing, when moratoriums end. And let me just ask you, we have a question for you both in a moment, but I want to just ask you, when you look at that ledge and you look at moratoriums coming, you look at what's out there, what don't we have in place today that we have to have? I mean, we all see this ledge coming. What's the missing safety cushion, if you will? We talk in recessions about soft landings or hard landings. How do we get a soft landing? Sarah?
Yeah, we are facing a very, very hard landing right out ahead of us. And I want to make sure we don't just limit it to eviction moratoriums. The way we have kept the housing market from not suffering much more extreme crisis to date has been the expansion in unemployment insurance payments that many families have received. Between that and the COVID, amazing number of people pay their rent before they feed their families sometimes, because without a roof over their head, they can't go on to solve their other challenges that this crisis has created. So the first thing we've got to do is Congress has to get back to work and reach an agreement around either extending the unemployment insurance or some kind of other housing support, or else we're going to have people on the street. And during a health crisis, evictions is really not the way to lower our spread and get our economy working.
Colleen, how would you?
On the rural side, I would just say that while the bill that people refer to as CARES contained a lot of money for urban and suburban residents, there was no money that was put in for rural residents. So one of the things that we are obviously advocating for is additional rental assistance, and especially rental assistance for people who currently right now don't have rental assistance and live in the properties that are owned and managed by our members.
And there were lots of people for whom the unemployment insurance didn't reach, which is why we saw the uptick there are a lot of people for whom the federal eviction moratoriums only covered those in properties that were assisted by HUD or by the GSEs. So there are a whole lot of folks that when these local eviction moratoriums are lifted, and unless we provide some sort of at least interim housing assistance or other income supports, we're going to see a very dramatic crisis hit our country this fall, right before an election.
I mean, it's such a whack-a-mole challenge. I mean, I have to say, just listening to you solve this one problem, it's going to pop over here because they're not there. But anyway, just fascinating. Let's take we have a question from Lou.
Hi, I'm Lou Tisler. I'm the Executive Director of National NeighborWorks Association, the trade association for 240 NeighborWorks organizations across the country. A membership that did over $9.5 billion of affordable housing and community development in 2019. We're based in DC, but I'm zooming in from Cleveland, Ohio. My question is, what should the path look like for a successful federal housing plan woven between an infrastructure, job creation, and if needed, additional COVID relief bill? Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. I love that question because it's basically saying is, what should our social contract on this be? So we'll finish with this, but Sarah, your thoughts?
So I think we ought to be doing some short-term steps that are building us towards the long-term future that we want to have. And I think that was exactly the right question. We need to come in and we need to prevent the things from getting worse. But if we are facing a huge recession and we knew we were facing an underlying supply problem for housing, this is an opportunity for us to create jobs and by increasing support for our supply programs, like the low-income housing tax credit and like rural housing development, and to create more units so that puts downward pressure on rents. And at the same time, we have to realize that our federal housing subsidy programs reach less than 20% in many places of the need that exists already. And if we want people to be able to go out and look for jobs and get the education they need and support their kids in schooling, especially schooling that's going to be remote, we need them to have stable housing. So let's work on a bridge so we prevent things getting worse. Let's start to build our supply programs and provide enough support so that people can work on the rest of the economy and can be active members of a thriving economic program.
Colleen, how would you answer this this social contract of the future, design it better? And definitely, I was very taken with your comments right now. I did not know it, that on these rural housing assistance, affordable support, that you weren't built into the CARES Act. So thank you. Colleen?
I would say that I think the success of affordable housing has been because of the private-public partnership that has developed over the years. And that's certainly a result of, as Sarah's mentioned, you've had previous speakers that mentioned the low-income housing tax credit and the housing bond programs. The 4% bond program is really, really important for when you're doing capital improvements and rehab and preservation. And there are efforts to try to do a flat 4%, which is very important because of the low interest rates right now. So I would say that, looking at what we have done, and the affordable industry as a whole have done to make all of the programs work together, I think it is really indicative of the fact that it's important to continue that relationship. Right. And it's important also we continue to say that, if you start talking about infrastructure needs, housing is part of infrastructure. You can bring broadband into a community, but if you don't have the people using that broadband and people living in houses, and kids in schools having to use broadband to go to school, it's important. So I think all the discussions on the table need to continue to happen, and there needs to be some action taken.
Right. Well, I want to thank you both, Colleen Fisher, Executive Director of the Council for Affordable and Rural Housing, and Sarah Rosen Wartell, President of the Urban Institute. Thank you for these insights. I thought this was a very edgy, great conversation, and thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thanks for having us, Steve.